Hi, my name is Professor Caitriona Beaumont from London South Bank University, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today as part of the Challenging Domesticity in Britain 1890 to 1990 AHRC research network. And many thanks to the organisations of the network for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about my work. So I'm going to share the screen with you with my slideshow and then talk to that for the rest of the presentation. So I hope that's okay and that it works. So here we go. Okay, so the title of my paper is Who Wants to be Mrs. 1963? How Housewives Associations Challenge the Stereotype of the Perfect Housewife in Post-War Britain. One of the many concerns that the current COVID-19 global pandemic has brought to the fore is the fear that for women the crisis will propel them not back to the future, but back to the 1950s. This dramatic claim is based on evidence published by the Office for National Statistics and other organisations, which indicate that since lockdown in March 2020, British women are spending significantly more time on unpaid domestic work than men. This in turn has a significant knock-on effect on their earning power, career prospects, health and welfare. When reporting on this worrying phenomenon, the phrase back to the 1950s has repeatedly been used in the media and by commentators to describe the negative impact of the pandemic on women, and I have captured some examples here on this slide, two from The Guardian and one from the Daily Mirror, which all use terms like back to the 1950s or 1950s housewife. The use of the term 1950s housewife evokes the popular trope used to envisage a time when women devoted themselves exclusively to home and family, with little time for anything else. It implies that women were always happy in this role and that this experience of domesticity for women was universal. The phrase 1950s housewife and the images that accompany it, and here's an example, I just did a screenshot of a Google image search for 1950s housewife, and it comes up with very predictable images, all which are fueled by nostalgia for Formica kitchens, 1950s fashion, the joys of home baking and housework. One of the obvious sources identified for perpetuating this one-dimensional representation of the 1950s housewife are mass circulation women's magazines so popular in the 1950s, for example, Woman, Women's Own and Women's Weekly. In the pages of these magazines, the now familiar image of the smiling, happy housewife dominate, thereby perpetuating the assumption that this was the experience of all wives and mothers in the 1950s and early 1960s. One excellent example is the 27th of April 1963 edition of Woman magazine, which had a 16-page pull-out booklet entitled A Housewife's Treasury: How to Keep Your Husband Happy. Here readers were advised on what is a wife, as along with many other things about how to be a good housewife. But in What is a Wife, she's advised that's a girl who works from 9 to 5 and whips up apple pie for supper, a woman who sets jam to gel, children to rights, and her hair for a Saturday night out. In the context of this popular magazine portrayal of women's lives, alongside the fact that marriage and motherhood was experienced by a majority of women during the 1950s and 1960s, it's perhaps understandable that the term back to the 1950s has been frequently used to raise the alarm about the impact of COVID-19 on women's lives. To do so, however, is a mistake. This error is reflective of a lack of knowledge and understanding within the media and among the wider public about the reality of many women's lives in Britain during the 1950s and 1960s. For example, Wendy Webster has noted in her book, Imagining Home, Gender, Race and National Identity, that the everyday experiences of women of colour living in Britain in the 50s and 60s are excluded from discussions around domesticity, and that their reality was often very different to the images published in women's magazines. Moreover, it may come as a surprise to learn that in the 50s and 60s, popular housewives associations, representing a predominantly white, middle-class sensibility, rejected this idealised version of the perfect wife. Take, for example, the Mothers' Union, the Women's Institutes and the Townswomen's Guilds, the three largest organisations for women in the UK. As you can see from the data on the slide here, during the mid-1950s, they all had really very significant memberships. The Mothers' Union was an organisation for Anglican wives and mothers, the Women's Institutes for rural women, and the Townswomen's Guilds for urban housewives. It all could be referred to as traditional housewives associations. As traditional women's groups, they championed the role of the full-time wife and mother, but they also rejected the assumption that women should only be interested in the domestic and think only about the needs of their husbands and children. For example, readers of the Townswomen's Guilds magazine, The Townswoman, were told in February 1963 that a housewife was more than a frilly woman and pretty creature whose ultimate aim in life was to pamper her skin and create the house beautiful. In January 1964, the Mothers' Union, through its magazine, Mothers' Union News, warned readers not to make an idol out of domesticity and to ignore suggestions that housewives and mothers should devote their lives entirely to husbands and children. Instead of conforming to the stereotype of the 1950s housewife, housewives associations instead encouraged women to get involved in life outside their homes, beyond the kitchen sink, and embrace their responsibilities as active citizens. So how did popular housewives associations challenge traditional assumptions about domesticity? This was achieved through a combination of practical support for wives and mothers, educational activities with a particular focus on encouraging women to engage in public life, and campaigning and lobbying at a local and national level for policy reforms that would enhance the lives of women. Here I can make only a brief reference to a few examples, but if you're interested and want to learn more, you can always read my book, nice plug there, and my journal articles, a link to one here on the slide, and my blogs, and another link to one there. As I've suggested, the reality of women's lives in the 1950s and 1960s was more complex and multifaceted than the depiction of the happy housewife prevalent in popular women's magazines. Women in the 1950s and 1960s faced significant new challenges in their daily lives. These included balancing domestic responsibilities with paid work, rearing children amidst a moral panic about youth crime and delinquency, becoming consumer experts, and for middle-class women, managing their homes and housework without the help of domestic servants. Working-class wives still face difficulties with bringing up families in substandard housing, and for those moving to new homes in the suburbs, adapting to life away from kinship networks could prove a lonely and alienating experience. So instead of embracing the stereotype of the perfect 1950s housewife, housewives associations set out to do what they could to support women in facing these challenges. Aware that increasing numbers of mothers would seek paid work outside the home, the Women's Institute leadership called on government and employers to provide greater assistance to working mothers. Their demands for what they referred to as married women's jobs included state-subsidised childcare, flexible working hours with time off for school holidays, and parental leave when children were ill. The Townswomen's Guilds also recognised the new demands made on women juggling childcare with paid work. They called on the state to provide funding for day nurseries, summer camps and after-school care. The Women's Institute also continued its support for the long campaign for equal pay and was delighted with the decision to introduce equal pay for women in the public sector from 1954. The campaign work of housewives associations on behalf of their members during the 1950s and 1960s was significant and varied, and yet it is often overlooked in standard historiographies of the period. For example, the Mothers' Union, Women's Institute and Townswomen's Guilds played an important role in public housing reform during the post-war years, and their input contributed to local authority plans that incorporated space for plans, as well as modern kitchens and comfortable living and dining rooms. Other campaigns involving housewives associations included calls for the decriminalisation of sex work, with the Mothers' Union submitting evidence to the Wolfenden Commission in 1955 calling for the removal of the term common prostitute from the statute book, which they viewed as an unjust discrimination against women. Housewives associations also campaigned around issues relating to women's sexual health, with the Town's Women's Guild supporting calls for the introduction of legalised abortion in 1965, 2 years before the introduction of the 1967 Abortion Act. In providing a public voice for housewives in the 1950s and 1960s, housewives associations debunked the idea that being a wife and mother was the be-all and end-all for women. Instead, it was argued that women, as wives, mothers, workers, and citizens, had a major contribution to make, not only to family life, but to the life of their communities and the nation. The work that housewives did and how they felt about their lives could not be represented by a single image of the perfect wife in popular women's magazines. Mrs. 1963 was able to challenge restrictive understandings of domesticity and begin to carve out a role for herself in public life. Acknowledging this, let us abandon our reliance on the stereotype of the 1950s housewife and banish it now and forever. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions or would like to have any further discussion with me about anything that I've discussed in this short presentation, don't hesitate to get in touch with me either by email or by Twitter, and my details are on the last slide here. So thanks again, and thanks to the Challenging Domesticity in Britain 1890 to 1990 network for this opportunity. Bye-bye, take care.